He had been the rock of calm in 1914 as the Germans approached Paris. But as 1916 and the battles of the Somme and Verdun had continued on and on with ever more French lives lost, confidence in General Joseph Joffre's leadership of the French army had flagged. And this week, Joffre is replaced. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, Bucharest, the capital of Romania, fell to the Central Powers, and the Romanian army retreated eastward after burning the oil fields. There were massacres of civilians by rival factions in Athens as Greece tried to remain neutral, though the British had declared a blockade and occupied Greek islands. There was political turmoil in Russia. Lloyd George became Britain's new prime minister, and in the Balkans, the city of Monastir was being shelled by the Bulgarians. There had been raids and counter-raids around Monastir for the past few weeks, actually, since the Allies had taken the city. But by this week, winter had really arrived, and operations were mostly suspended. Now, the casualties on the Macedonian front, when compared to those of, say, the Western or Eastern fronts, might seem trivial to some, but we're still talking about tens of thousands of human beings. Since August, the Serbs had taken 27,551 casualties, the French 13,786, the Russians 1,701, and the Italians 342. The British had taken 5,048 casualties there, but had also suffered nearly 30,000 cases of malaria. And of those, over 20,000 had been evacuated. For the Central Powers, the Bulgarians had casualties of around 52,000 men, and the Germans around 8,000. So that front went quiet, but another front we haven't heard from much lately flared into action. The Mesopotamian front, which had been quiet all summer and fall. Well, quiet in terms of action. The Indian Labor Corps had been brought in to basically fix the Tigris River to make it ready for British action. They reclaimed land, dug navigation channels, and deepened harbors. Camps for troop reinforcements were built, as well as military hospitals and warehouses. They even built a special new steamboat specifically for Tigris conditions, with a shallow draft and capable of handling strong currents. These P-50 steamers had been arriving for weeks now and would prove invaluable. Railway lines were laid down where possible, and a metalled road with bridges over the hundreds of creeks was built from Basra up to the front. A repeat of the failure to relieve the army that had been forced to surrender at Kut al-Amara in the spring would not happen again. And military supplies were pouring in. Howitzers, machine guns, scouting aircraft, and ammunition by the ton. The 4 divisions of the Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force numbered 160,000 men. Lieutenant General Sir Stanley Maude was now in charge, but he had been given specific instructions by Chief of the British Imperial General Staff William Robertson to secure the oil fields, the pipelines, and the Basra region. Taking Baghdad was only mentioned with a stern warning that advances were not to be made unless sanctioned. But Maude wanted nothing less than total victory over the Ottomans in Mesopotamia. His first move came December 13th, 1916. He wasn't using any strategy much different from his predecessors on the Tigris, but this time he wasn't limited by floods and he was under no time constraints. He made a diversionary bombardment on Saniyat and a night march so his men were able to cross the Shat el Hai that fed into the Tigris on the west bank opposite Kut. Bombing missions on the Turkish steamer that set up pontoon bridges caused it to release its tows and scatter pontoons all over the Tigris. So now the Ottomans could no longer readily cross the river. Things were looking up for the British, but bad weather caused a suspension of activities for the rest of the month. But there was no suspension of activities in the political shakeups that had been going on for a couple of weeks. In Britain this week, Lord Grey resigned as Foreign Secretary and Lord Derby became the new Secretary of State for War. In Austria, Ernest von Kober resigned as Premier after under 2 months on the job. And in France, there was even bigger news. General Robert Nivelle became the new Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, replacing General Joseph Joffre. Nivelle had organized the successful French creeping barrage and communications for the big counteroffensive at Verdun in October, and he was the new man of the hour. And the logical successor to Joffre, Generals de Castelnau and Foch, were passed over for the new hero. even Nivelle's immediate superior, Philippe Pétain, was passed over. That was partly because the politicians knew of Pétain's contempt for them. He had once said of French President Raymond Poincaré, "Nobody was better placed than the president himself to be aware that France was neither led nor governed." Nivelle, on the other hand, had a great ability to charm the elected politicians. Straight away, during what would prove to be the coldest winter of the war, Nivelle launched another heavy attack at Verdun, north of Douaumont, at the end of the week. The front line there is now back almost to where it was 9 months ago. French Premier Aristide was also in the news this week. On the 12th, notes were passed by the 4 Central Powers to American ambassadors to tell Entente governments that they are ready to negotiate for peace. The next day, Briand summed up the German peace note as, "Heads I win, tails you lose." But Germany had been quite successful in the field recently, in Romania. The armies on both sides, however, were reaching their limits. Many units having seen continuous combat for weeks. Rain had caused rivers to overflow and highways to become mud baths. German General Erich von Falkenhayn's supply base was hundreds of kilometers away, and his men had outrun their supplies, so he ordered a day of rest on the 8th. The loss of their capital city had demoralized the Romanian army as it now headed east, and King Ferdinand knew that more Russian help was crucial, but this came with a quid pro quo. Now, the Russians currently had 12 divisions in Romania, mostly in Moldavia, and they proposed to create an army group with them in charge of any Romanian units fit to fight. This was rejected, but King Ferdinand was put in charge of the Romanian front with a Romanian and a Russian general in charge of their respective forces. But in reality, the Russian general had control. And that general was Vladimir Sakharov, who we saw a lot of last summer in the Brusilov offensive. Romanian Army Chief of Staff Dumitru Iliescu became the scapegoat for losing the capital and the richest province of the country after only around 100 days of fighting, and lost his job. And Constantin Prezan, against his will, became the new Chief of Staff. And Falkenhayn was on the move again the 9th. He catalogued what his men had done since beginning the crossing of Wallachia, which included taking 70,000 prisoners, 125 artillery pieces, 145 machine guns, and the capital city. The total number of prisoners was now in the hundreds of thousands. By the end of the week, Falkenhayn's men entered Butsau. August von Mackensen's Danube army was over the Jalomita River, northeast of Bucharest, and all Wallachia was cleared of Allied troops south of the Bucharest-Cernavoda line. But the Germans were having serious problems. The roads were in such poor shape they were nearly impassable. Many were littered with horses' corpses and broken wagons. The drinking water gave most of the soldiers diarrhea. Discipline seriously eroded and looting took place. Falkenhayn knew the situation called for hard pursuit, but he kind of saw that his army didn't have the strength for it. So that was the guys advancing on the plains of Wallachia. In the foothills to the north, the Romanian defenses were more effective, and the Germans had to fight for every kilometer as they approached Butsau. And in northern Dobruja, between the Danube and the Black Sea, the Bulgarian Third Army was driving north. And we come to the end of the week. The Macedonian front goes quiet as the Mesopotamian comes to life after months of preparations. The Central Powers continue to advance in Romania, despite their exhaustion, and political shakeups dot the map of Europe. So, General Nivelle was now in charge of the French army. Joffre had been surpassed. All Pétain had organized and achieved at Verdun was overlooked. And the brash and fiery Nivelle would have his day. Nivelle spoke fluent English, which was good, and as I said, he was very popular with politicians, both French and British. And there's no question that his organization of the creeping barrage in October was brilliant. But even over last summer, even just after he took command at Verdun, he was already being accused of wasting French lives. Perhaps all generals are accused of this occasionally. But even though Nivelle was the public darling, those accusing voices had grown louder and louder as the year went on, and they would grow to a ringing crescendo in 1917. If you're curious about what Pétain actually achieved at Verdun, you can click right here to check out our special episode about him. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Jan Mart. Help us out on Patreon to make this show better and better and get cool perks in return. You can also like us on Facebook, Follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with all the announcements regarding the show. See you next time.